Aloha and welcome to another edition of the Hardline, according to Stonefruit, with Mark French. We are on a roll, my friend. We need to discuss what previous geniuses have said about ideology.
Sure, absolutely.
And since the Disinformation Governance Board has put the Ministry of Truth and the novel 1984 back in the news, Orwell is a pretty good place to start. But I'd also like to look at two other great post-Marxist thinkers, Louis Althusser and the legendary Italian socialist Antonio Gramsci. And as a quick aside, I was shocked to learn during the presidential campaign that Pete Buttigieg's father is the guy who translated and interpreted Gramsci into the English-speaking part of the world.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And Kamala Harris's dad was a radical agronomist, a radical agricultural economist.
Mm-hmm.
These are two examples of fruit falling very far from the tree.
Yeah.
So Orwellian, like Kafkaesque, can occasionally suffer from overuse, but only because there's no other words that can really substitute for it.
Sure.
And the novel 1984 remains such an enduring vision of dystopia because it foresees a world based on two key features. One being torture and violence, and the other being the control of language. Now, torture and violence can be easily understood. It has been a key feature of American life since Plymouth Rock and the essence of America's continental expansion, which also shows that America has never really been a great signatory to contracts. But it's also been a central part of its overseas colonization.
Absolutely.
And, you know, no one, it rarely is it mentioned that America killed 200,000 Filipinos during the 1898 Spanish-American War, and in the following years when they refused to just let the Filipinos hang out their shingle of independence.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And during the Filipino engagement, during those conversations around the continuation of Manifest Destiny, the same type of language of Americans being greeted as liberators was used as if it were to this day in Afghanistan and Iraq. They really truly believe that.
And in a lot of America's other colonizing efforts, they say, it is our duty to Christianize them. Well, the Philippines had been a devout Catholic for 300 years by then.
Yeah. And now they've just replaced the word Christianize with democratize.
Yeah, especially in the post-World War II era.
Which really just stands for forcing people to participate in this neo-feudal capitalist system by force, not choice.
Right. The Bretton Woods monetary regime was a neocolonial regime that did have torture and violence as a central part of it, but was also neocolonial extraction. And the use of torture and violence as overt state policy continues to this day in the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia.
That's right.
which is referred to among Latin American military circles as escuelas de golpes, the school of the coups.
Right.
But his focus on the control of language is, oh, well, before we get off the torture and violence tip, who could forget Abu Ghraib, which now it's a legal integral part of America's engagement overseas and places that we control, like Guantanamo Bay. But such to dip now into Orwellian as a moniker for the control of language. That single word, Orwellian, has so much power because no other word can stand so well for saying one thing and meaning something completely different in the furtherance of political objectives. And that process is called doublethink. And because it is so central to the disinformation governance regime of the powers that be, and the information environment swirling all around us today, it bears some close examination. So here's a paragraph from 1984 where Orwell lays out the process of doublethink. To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them both to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, and then to draw it back into memory again the moment it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again. That was the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. That is quite a prescription. And in 1984, it was induced by trauma, by violence. And our major friends of show, Post-Orthodoxy, had Kathy O'Brien on, who was an MK Ultra victim, the trauma-based mind control program of the CIA. And they have examined how the trauma of everyday living in late capitalism in America is itself a significant source of trauma that exerts mind control over all of us.
Absolutely.
But I think doublethink can also be achieved by people who are attracted to utilizing doublethink, not just those who are traumatized into using doublethink. As we discussed in an earlier episode, that Ivy League schools and their peer elite institutions graduate students by the squadron that see the attractiveness, a path of least resistance to wealth and power and prestige as stars of a tyrannical meritocracy. They are willing to doublethink because they know of the benefits it will give them.
Yeah, and to take it one step further, another layer could be when you see the writing on the wall and you think that is your only choice is to participate in the DC and New York bubble and Machiavellian games, or suffer and be one of the plebes, you might just give into it regardless of whether you're stricken with consciousness or not.
I hear it often referred to as the coastal elites,
Yes.
because in addition to DC and New York,
Oh, sure. Can't
we
leave out the California squad.
we can't leave out the Bay Area,
Yeah,
which
that's right.
which is big tech and some major institutions of higher education,
Sure.
and LA as the dream factory, a
Yeah,
bastion of American soft power.
sure.
The
And
cult,
Seattle has Bezos and Gates and yeah,
Seattle is another major hub of big tech, and
certainly.
back on the East Coast, we can't forget Boston,
Hmm.
major hotbed of higher education. So a
That's
lot of
right.
people say the coastal elites, and they don't need to be tortured into serving the system. They
Right.
know that it will grant them the highest echelons of privilege and power. But I think some of them might believe that they are not just vapid and shallow. They might believe a utilitarian, noble lie, something akin to Jeremy Bentham's fundamental axiom of, quote, the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong, end quote. I I sincerely believe, well, I don't know, I can't speak for Obama, but I think at that, let's say at that uh, multi-Olympiad gold medal winning level of neoliberal salesmanship, that he might believe that he is working within a constrained system to, as Bentham said, provide the greatest happiness to the greatest number as the measure of right and wrong.
Yeah.
And in their minds, earning fat hourly rates that get paid assiduously and hustling big money donations for their foundations and think tanks are just the means to that end.
Sure.
So let us examine in more detail how parties can impose their will on one another. There is a continuum of violence, actual violence, the threat of violence or incarceration, begrudging consent, indifferent consent, and enthusiastic consent. And to begin to look at this continuum, I would like to call upon Althusser. And he had a very popular, has a popular theoretical construction of the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus. The repressive state apparatus is the government, the administration, the military, police, judiciary, and prisons. So that's pretty straightforward because it does deal exclusively with violence, but more conceptually complicated is the ideological component. The information war that non-friend of show Nina Jankowicz wrote her book about, how to lose the information war. So these people recreate the ideology as they consume it and as they express it, in the case of Obama at the Stanford, or Nina in her new role as the cheerleader of the information war. And the responsibilities inherent in its reproduction by these high level operatives makes them and their ilk uniquely blind to the foibles, the lacuna, the suicidal impulses, and now the terminal state of this ideology. By buying into the system, they exclude any alternatives that the system has already foreclosed. To more deeply understand the ideological state apparatus, let's see what its components are. Religion, education, the family, the legal system, the political system, including parties, labor unions. You can tell he's a European. We haven't had labor unions as a powerful fact in America since the 70s.
Sure.
In communications, in block, he mentioned press, radio, and television. Of course, now we have to add the internet and social media.
That's
And
right.
culture, which he included literature, the arts, and sports. So, whereas the repressive state apparatus deals with violence, the ideological state apparatus functions by ideology. Another one we might want to look at is Gramsci and his hugely influential notion of hegemony. Now, this was a process by which the ruling class generalizes its class interests as the interests of society as a whole.
That's right.
By providing for at least some of the needs of the subordinate classes in the process of their leadership. It's not just the ideology they're peddling, it's because they can deliver on certain basic elements of the social contract. And it resides in the equilibrium between consent and coercion. But I think why hegemony is falling to pieces now, and they're so keen to create something as ominous as a disinformation governance board, is because they know that they've given up on trying to provide some of the most fundamental aspects of the social contract.
Absolutely. I mean, the housing in and of itself shows that clearly.
You mean how the hedge funds and the big
The,
banks are moving in
yes,
residential
the
property?
lack, yeah, the lack of housing and the skyrocketing costs, turning over one of the most essential functions of a healthy society to rapacious capital extraction and flight, and making it a lottery instead of a human right. It tells you everything you need to know about the current climate. They just have zero interest in meeting the needs of normal people anymore. It's over. It feels like the purposeful collapse of the public sector for them to privatize everything and extract every last ounce they can get from this current order.
I used to like to say that the Democrat wing of the oligarchy represented the controlled demolition of
Sure.
the working class and the middle class, and that the Republican wing of the oligarchy represented focused fire on the middle class and the working class. But I'm not so sure that there's much of a distinction anymore, even in the pace that they are trying to destroy the people of this once great republic.
Yeah.
And no discussion of 1984 is complete without at least a fleeting reference to Huxley's other dystopian classic, Brave New World.
That's right.
And in many ways, I think his description is closer to what we are experiencing today, where he talks about the way that sex and drugs and amusement and medicalized social engineering can play such key roles in creating the dystopia that he envisaged in 1936.
That's right.
And there's been some seminal works of cultural criticism that have followed up on that. Neil Postman, in a talk in 1984 about 1984, looked at Brave New World, about how it might have been a better description of what was going on. And he wrote the 1985 classic, Amusing Ourselves to Death,
Right.
which, except for reference to the internet and social media and the fact that his examples are outdated, is a superlative piece of cultural criticism that is still relevant today, 35 plus years later.
Certainly.
So, if I were to say whether the general population in America is giving a begrudging, indifferent, or enthusiastic consent to the social, cultural, and material conditions of their life, I would say it is indifferent at best. And the rich we have always had with us, but it seems to be getting worse. The late 19th century had the robber barons. The post-World War II era had had Mill's power elite, and now we have Occupy's 1% and Davos man. So as the Bible said, the poor you shall always have with you, the rich we shall always have with us, but they're in a uniquely powerful position right now to decimate the remaining aspects of even a pretense to a social contract within what is a purported democracy.
That's right.
And we have to thank the populists and the anarchists and the socialists and the communists and the social movements and the labor unions that gave us some respite from the robber barons and the political pressure necessary to enact the New Deal. Electoral politics is not the answer, I think.
No.
I think we need only to look back to the New Deal to see that it was the people that never took formal power that created the social necessity for Roosevelt to give us the New Deal.
Yeah, and to set even further context, I mean, look at what is happening in the UK dealing with Thatcher's legacy. So they took on the same exact financialization, hyper-globalization model. And their living standards have been declining as long, even faster than here in the United States.
And social movements ended Jim Crow when we got the Civil Rights Act. And they recast the New Deal as the Great Society. But the entire counter-revolution against the New Deal itself and the Great Society itself and the Civil Rights Act was a concerted attempt by the business class to destroy the gains of those two great moments of American legislation.
Yeah.
And that began with the 1971 Powell memo.
That's right.
Where, my God, he laid out a blueprint of what business should do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And anyone that wants a more detailed elaboration of the Powell memo can, of course, go to stonefruit.substack.com, but they could also buy my book, A Policy History of Standards-Based Education in America, where I lay out how the right and big business worked together in active partnership to destroy the New Deal and to destroy the Great Society, acting on this extremely succinct and clear blueprint. And they did it. 50 years later, here we are.
Yeah.
So the genius of neoliberalism since Reagan has been to steadily withdraw from the life of the people all of the good and necessary things that usually cultivate a stronger than indifferent consent from the governed. And although the blue team was tardy catching up, by the late 80s and early 90s with the Democratic Leadership Council, they did.
Yeah, Bill Clinton successfully put them on par fundraising wise.
And that was
and started the fast forward movement away from working people.
exactly. And we can just throw out a few things to characterize what we mean by neoliberalism, which by that time was bipartisan.
Yes.
And that is the imperative to maximize profits by reducing labor costs and creating globe spanning just in time supply lines,
Yeah.
offshoring productive capacity,
Mhm.
hollowing out the manufacturing base in favor of fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, and turning the labor force into a grossly underpaid clerical service precariat.
That's right.
36% of whom are in the gig economy.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've been looking into a lot of the realists in international relations lately because I hope we can have a look at China's role in future episodes of the Hardline according to Stonefruit.
Mhm.
And where I think people like Mearsheimer and other realists stumble is by thinking that the state is the primary actor in international relations and that it's rational and it's the actor. I don't think it is rational or the sole primary actor. I think Mearsheimer and other realists in international relations completely fail to admit that there is a power above and behind the nation states. And that the political class and big media and big tech and the bloviating punditocracy use the nation state as their plaything.
That's right.
Oh no, let me rephrase that. The neoliberal powers above and behind, they use the nation state, the political class, and big media and big tech as their playthings. And now that the Western oligarchs have gained complete and total control over the national governments of the so-called core states of global capitalism, they've subordinated the interests of the people in those representative democracies beneath those of the nation states that they use as tools to serve themselves. Neoliberal international finance capital is a supranational corporate kleptocracy that privatizes the benefits, socializes the costs, encloses the commons, gives spondylux aplenty. I love that word. That's a real word. Spondylux. It's an SAT word for money.
Mhm.
Gives spondylux aplenty to the well-connected and privatizes the cost of living, food, shelter, transportation, education in as aggressive and unrelenting a manner as possible. That's where I think all the people in academia are completely missing the boat. And it's left to outsiders like you and I to catch what they're missing. These people at the highest echelons of academia don't see this.
Sure.
The average American could probably intuit or list dozens of things that need to change drastically and right away if we're
Yeah.
to avoid ruin.
Right.
I mean, everyone's got a list. I've got mine.
Sure.
And it would be to overturn Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that allowed unlimited amounts of money into the political process.
Mhm.
It would be to eliminate the high cost of elections by having publicly financed elections.
Yeah.
It would be ranked choice voting and other electoral reforms to break the duopoly's stranglehold on power
Sure.
and give other parties a chance to win some races. I made my first political donation to the People's Party, and now I'm seeing even they are having their issues, their birthing pains. Primo Radical has had some guests on, another YouTuber that looked at some of the shenanigans that went on when they appointed Howie Hawkins as the Green candidate behind the scenes. So even some of these non-oligarchy parties have their own institutional problems.
Sure.
So how are we going to get more parties to operate, Mark?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, it just feels so defunct and bereft of any quality people or ethics or morality. I mean, it just feels so broken right now. I'm not quite
Yes.
sure how this is going to turn out.
Yeah. Dark Sevier from Post Orthodoxy has said more than once that I can't believe it's still going on. And
Yeah.
I think he and I have been waiting for the big crash for decades.
Sure.
And I think he and I both kind of anticipate and are rubbing our hands together in anticipation, eager anticipation of a kind of a Wagnerian collapse of the decor of the opera house collapsing all around us as neoliberalism comes crashing down. But it's not crashing down like that, and perhaps it never will. It just seems to be such a small cascading uh, series of smaller shocks and smaller repressions.
I just don't know how bad it has to get for normal people to start participating in these policy discussions in a meaningful way. I really do not understand what most people talk about in their free time. It seems like things, and maybe it is just the trauma of day to day living for most people in this country. Maybe that's all it is. But I'm of mind, especially with inflation around 10% real, things are going to get so bad here pretty soon for normal people. They're not going to have much of a choice but to start paying attention to some of this stuff.
I wonder when it's going to happen and what it's going to take.
Sure.
And I have a friend who thinks that the sky is falling now, and I used to be a lot more paranoid, but I got over that and think that it was
Yeah.
happening around me. But now I have a pithy little formula that I call the 320s,
Hmm.
and that's 20% inflation, $20 uh, per gallon gas,
Right.
and 20% return on treasury bills when international investors start dramatically losing faith in the petrodollar.
Right.
And if we're at 10% inflation now and I just got to fill up, it cost me $70. We're
Right.
about 503 out here in Oregon.
Yeah.
And I haven't checked T bills now, but if they're over a percent, I'd be surprised. So we're not there yet. And I think those will be markers. I think another big marker will be when the dollar gets below, say, 50% of international trade.
Sure.
I'm not exactly sure when it is, where it is now, but it's certainly been decreasing over the years. And I think there might be some reasonable number that's a good marker as to when the American public and the public of the other core states of global capitalism start to realize that something is afoot.
Yeah, and there's two clear things that go together um, that characterize when things really spin out of control. And You know, Alfred McCoy puts this in a very succinct way when he states that things can spin out of control very, very quickly, mind-numbingly fast once they start to go. So once the United States reaches a Suez Canal type moment, and you can almost feel the velocity building now. And then right before a major reset or collapse of some sort is when the state starts acting most courageous and confident and belligerent. And both of those things are happening right now. So there's a great deal of spying, suppression, mixed with very arrogant language, economically and geopolitically. So what is going to light the tinder? It could come from so many different directions, but once it goes, I don't think most people understand how ugly things could get here, how quickly. They've created a permanent underclass already that's going to take multiple generations to address, if it ever gets addressed. Not since the Egyptian Pharisees have things gotten this unequal. It really is that serious. And working people aren't holding any of the cards at all. They literally have nothing to fall back on. With these skyrocketing housing costs and inflation, and private capital buying up all the residences, I mean, they're going to explode homelessness because nowhere in the United States can any of these gig jobs even pay for a 2-bedroom apartment. So you're talking about tripling or quadrupling homelessness in just the next 5 years. 10 at the most. So there are some very strange tensions afoot that this country has never had to deal with before in its entire history. That's the only thing that staved off revolution the last time, is we dispossessed the people that were already here, and the government had free land to literally give away to keep the lid on things. And that can't happen now. They're going the opposite direction. They're dispossessing people of property.
There was always some other profit center to exploit that
That's
always
right.
saved the bacon of the political order.
That's right.
For example, in UK, when feudalism was getting too tight, then they had the enclosure moment that made the former commons an exploitable commodity. And my concern is that from then in UK, that was in the 1600s-ish, to now, I think it is exactly the housing market is the last profit center neoliberal finance capital has in America. So it could be enormously fast. And you mentioned that no one can afford housing. I heard something today that there is not a single city in America where the median income can enable one to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And let us look at the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. What did that start as? I think it was a border crossing from Hungary to Germany. I might have the geography off a little, but it was a single border crossing was available from the Warsaw Pact countries to the west. And that, in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, that spun out into the Berlin Wall coming down.
That's right.
And that wasn't electoral politics. That wasn't even social movements. That was a system that was just so ready to collapse under the rot of its own making.
Yeah.
And to round out my list of things that I think need to change before we have any possibility of America straightening up and flying right, it's obviously lobbying, because a congressperson makes $160,000 a year, but if they stay there 2 or 3 terms and they know who to talk to and get everyone's phone numbers, then they can make 10 times that, 20 times that easily as a K Street lobbyist. And every regulatory agency has been captured by the industry it regulates. That's another outcome of the Powell memo and the big businesses counter revolution against the Great Society and the New Deal, is that all, Chris Hedges rightly calls Nixon the last liberal president, because he was the last president that had to deal with the actual existence of social movements. And in response to them, he created things. And Nader, Ralph Nader's work in the consumer rights movement, that got America the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act,
Let out of gas, yeah.
out of gas,
Seat belts, yeah, sure.
and they've kept the lead out of gas and the seatbelts in the cars, but they've certainly destroyed the EPA and CDC and FCC, and right down the line, all of the regulatory agencies are captured, and all of the chairs of the subject matter committees in Congress all become lobbyists for that industry. And there weren't that many lobbyists around the time of the Powell memo, maybe a few hundred.
Right. Yeah.
Max. And now there's thousands.
Tens of thousands. Yeah. I mean, and that's a very good point. That's another exacerbating negative quality about inequality becoming this bad. The people that are hoarding all of the money, look at the explosion in NGOs and lobbying firms and corporate firms. Look at all the money spent on this redundancy, and look at the brain drain within our society of everyone that chooses to just be a corporate lawyer, to lobby or write these terrible laws, or just go to Wall Street. It's a feedback loop, and it's creating ticking time bombs of externalities everywhere.
Yes, and a lot of people are well aware of what used to be the Koch brothers. Now it's just one Koch brother, since one of them died.
Right. Yeah.
Of them being the epitome of, or taking a leadership role in the right wing's dark money filtering into politics.
Heritage Foundation, things of that nature. Yeah.
Exactly. But the left has the Center for American Progress and Brookings Institution and all of its big think tanks. But it also has its lesser known dark money conduits. And in the previous episode of the Hardline According to Stonefruit, we looked at the broad systematic strategy of the disinformation governance regime that Nina Jankowicz will now be a single point of contact to, of not only between big tech and the government, but the government and all of the minions that are doing the fact checking and whatnot. And I have looked at a number of these alleged fact checkers in detail, and some of them go back to multi-billion-dollar Democrat machines, dark money machines, like the Annabelle Associates. I believe they fund Media Matters and dozens of other liberal, this is a capital L liberal, not small L liberal like John Stuart Mills and Jeremy Bentham, that in the main, may seem to be consistent with traditional democratic ideals, even New Deal and Great Society ideals. But within that portfolio of causes that they also fund some incredibly strategically powerful ones like Media Matters that are just pure shit lib, blue anon, attack dogs, and ideological snipers. But Mark, I don't see how anything short of widespread labor militancy or mass direct action, that there's any alternative, that this just all collapses under the weight of its own plutocracy.
I agree with that. That's the way that it feels. There is just a pervasive feeling that all of this is completely encased, completely siloed, completely monopolized. It's moving very, very quickly. And how you've been pointing out these last few weeks, look at the amount of time and money and resources that are being poured into all of these agencies on both sides just to keep things encased and exactly the same. There is no change coming from those that are in power right now. None. This is what the big idea was. They don't plan on doing a damn thing.
And that is why I think Biden is uniquely appropriate as a figurehead for this moment,
And how?
because it is exactly the 4 decades that he has spent trying to become president
Yes.
that has been the decades of the worst onslaught of bipartisan neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And I think this system, whose sole purpose over that period has been to extract as much surplus value as possible without resorting to coercion on an even grander scale than it already engages in, and
Yeah.
incarceration on an even grander scale than it already engages in, or to precipitate revolution. I think they're just trying to bring it right up to that red line of just right before revolution. And I think that's their only plan, and why Biden is perfect, because his function is to deliver absolutely nothing.
And we've had no serious anti-war movement whatsoever since Vietnam. And it's just been constant foreign boogeymen to keep everyone distracted, as productivity in this country has skyrocketed since the 70s, but wages have remained flat. They will use any tool necessary to keep the Barnum and Bailey, there's a sucker born every minute. There is constant distractions going on from every single direction while they just run out the back door with the cash.
Yeah, Barnum has another great quote, no one ever went broke underestimating the ignorance of the American people.
Yeah.
And I think that the way Joe Biden's mind is singularly blank due to rapid onset dementia, so too is the system itself singularly blank and without ideas as to how it could forestall its own self-immolation,
Yeah.
and us with it. That it's in this trap of its own making at the end of the line, in what the sociologists call path dependency, which is being trapped into going forward in the same path that you've already been on before.
I mean, we are really seeing the Edward Bernays Mad Men advertising, marketing, spin pushed to its extreme and max capacity. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It could lead to self-immolation, but they have no other tricks. That is the deal. The United States has been a country of wildcatting snake oil salesmen for a very long time to uphold a plutocracy, but there's nothing left for them to steal.
And previously, if the government's function was to expropriate as much surplus value from the people as it possibly could, that was a relatively slow, tedious, complicated process. But now they're just giving away money. I mean, when we started our partnership, one of the ideas I proposed was to look at the CARES Act and to see how many trillions that the federal government gave to the oligarchs directly to the corporations and the hedge funds in the guise of a stimulus check for peanuts.
Yeah, that's right.
And then Ben Norton, in his interviews plural with Michael Hudson, turned me on to the repo scheme that escaped my notice and certainly wasn't in the mainstream media. That in addition to the 1.5 trillion that they gave those entities in the CARES Act, that they gave, I believe it was 4.5 trillion to the hedge funds, the oligarchs, in this unknown initiative. So they're not even trying to suck it out of us from taxes. They're just giving it to the rich.
Putting it directly on their balance sheets. I don't know what all this hoarding is for.
I'm surprised the stock market's doing so bad because all this money has to go somewhere, and equities is certainly one of the traditional avenues it's gone into.
We are in a very unique situation.
So that's Biden's role, to my mind, is to serve as a mediating buffer between the oligarchs and the citizenry.
He told everyone the truth during his campaign. Nothing will fundamentally change. Nothing.
And it can't change in a citizenry that is too, as Neil Postman said in his 1985 classic, too amused to death, too ill-educated, too exhausted by struggling to make ends meet, too atomized by social media and big media to even begin to imagine a better world.
That's right.
So how incomparably atrocious Biden is as a person or a politician, or how instrumentally responsible he is for all of the legislation that has kept us all incarcerated or in debt peonage, it doesn't seem to matter to anyone.
Over this next 10 or 15 or 20 years, as people begin to really be able to see how badly they were just ripped off and how much money was just corruptly given away to places that did not need it in the first place. And this is on the heels of Trump giving away $2 trillion in tax cuts to the same people that just put their hand right back into the cookie jar.
Yes. I don't know where this is going, Mark, but it can't be any type of good.
Very strange.
But as George Carlin said, when you're born in modern times, you're born to a freak show. And when you're born in America, you got front row seats.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen of the internet and the world beyond, this has been yet another episode of the Hardline, according to Stonefruit.
Take care, everybody.
Peace out.